All right, good morning, everybody. Lindsay and I will be sharing the GCC calendar for the upcoming year. It should be straightforward. Lindsay will go in depth with what to expect during the year. And I would just basically to tell you what to look for. You should write these dates down, put them in your calendar or whatever. So let's get started. Between December 1st and January 31st, EBS application period. This will be your application period, December 1st through January 31st. Then you will have a preliminary review phase. Then you will have in April, the committee will review and score your applications. In May, the committee will vote on the application. In June, the commission votes on the applications and notifications will be sent out. July to September, modifications and review and projects will be awarded. On October 1st, all projects should be open except juvenile justice. And on January 1st, juvenile justice projects should be open.
John, and just as a caveat, obviously, folks who are experienced with the Governor's Crime Commission grant process, but maybe folks who are not, we try to adhere to this calendar as best as possible. However, there are things that come through, decisions that come through from the federal side, including shutdowns, and other things that really kind of at times can inhibit our ability to align closely or align specifically with this calendar. But we do make every effort as best as possible to be able to have this be the typical grant award calendar as we move through the process each year. And can everybody see, because I want to make sure, can everybody see the top header? Because my controls are in the way, so I just want to make sure that it's not for y'all.
We can see it.
Okay, just wanted to double check. Okay, so from December 1st to January 31st, that will be the application period for grant awards for all of our funding sources in EBS. So that has shifted slightly. Folks who are familiar with our grant award process and our application process have typically seen that application open on November 1st. But we have shifted this for multiple conversations and multiple feedback to December 1st, from December 1st to January 31st in EBS. So our 2025 priorities are open as of today and will be available in EBS no later than tomorrow. So the GCC staff is available during this application process to answer any related questions, truly from beginning to end. Planners typically, but also your grant managers and administrators if you are working with them or have one currently. So the deadline for your application submission is going to be 11:59 p.m. Eastern time on January 31st. So we want to make sure that everything is not only completed in your application, but that it is actually submitted in the system by that deadline. So we've got folks who will, have everything completed, but won't actually submit it. So we want to make sure that that is done as well by that deadline. So things that you should be considering at the beginning of this process and ensuring you're able to move forward quickly is going to be determining who your officials are going to be for these particular grant applications, whether you have applying for one across, in one funding source or multiple across multiple funding sources. So determining your authorizing official, your financial officer, and your project director, which are the required project officials in each grant application. You're going to ensure that you have NCIDs set up for each person who is going to be a project official and also who is going to be completing the application for you if that is going to be somebody who is different than any one of those officials. You're going to want to ensure that you have your GCC specific access set up in EBS. We have a lot of agencies that have access to EBS already. but maybe don't necessarily, maybe they have access to Council for Women and Youth Involvement or other agencies that utilize EBS. So you want to make sure that when you sign in, you have access to the GCC specific tiles, and we have instructions in regards to how to complete that process. You're going to want to look at each of the RFAs closely that are posted, each of the requests for applications, which are grant solicitations. You're going to look at those very closely and look over any of the required attachments. Some of those documentation requirements do very much take some time to get together. So you want to kind of know what those look like ahead of time so that you know and are able to submit them in a timely fashion with your application. And then you're going to want to ensure that your agency has their UEID or their unique identity identifier from sam.gov. So once these applications have been submitted, staff goes through what we refer to as a preliminary review phase internally. The applications we look over and we ensure that they meet the eligibility criteria for each funding source, or for the funding source that they've applied under. We also look over the application in an overall scope to ensure that the instructions in the RFA were followed. We look and assess the allowability of costs and activities that are included in the budgets to ensure that the majority of the applications are not submitted in a funding source where those items or those activities are not unallowable. We look at the submission of the priority, the program priority that they were submitted under, to ensure that they fit the program priority and meet those requirements for each specific priority that is being applied for. We do look at required attachments and look and ensure that they're uploaded and then they are named as instructed in the RFA. That is actually quite important. Because we want to ensure that everything is consistent across these applications, and the projects have everything that we need to be able to consider the grant for funding and move forward. And then we also want to ensure that the project period that is listed aligns with the funding sources. So we have funding sources who have shifted to longer periods of performance. So we want to ensure that the information and the application is aligning with that RFA and with the project period that will be granted to that specific funding source. And then in April, we go through our committee reviewing and scoring of the applications that move through this preliminary phase. Applications, of course, that pass the preliminary phase are then sent to each GCC committee for review and scoring. We have our Crime Victim Services Committee that looks at VOCA and VAWA. We have our Criminal Justice Improvement, which looks at our Burn JAG and multiple other funding sources. We have our Juvenile Justice Committee that looks through the juvenile justice applications and the Children Justice Act and a couple other sources as well. So then there's a full review of the grant application, including concept and the budget. And this is a lot of these items are outlined in the RFA, and of course will be further explained as well in these other sessions. But we look at specifically who will be benefiting from the grant, how many individuals or communities will benefit from the grant, the cost of administering the grant, of course. And then the geographical representation that is provided services through the grant. And then we also look at past performance of the applicant with grants and publicly funded awards. Some of that is eligibility criteria. We cannot fund agencies that are on suspension of funding lists or who have compliance or auditing concerns or issues that might preclude them from being funded. So typically through this process, in regards to the committee review and scoring, we have 3 reviewers at a minimum per application, depending on the committee. So the average score of the reviewers determines the application score or the overall score that each application receives. And then the applications are ranked in score order within each priority under each funding source that they apply under. So in May, we look at the committee's voting. So the review application So the committees review application scores by priority after they have been ranked by the score in each priority. They assess again the geographical and needs specific reach of the projects throughout the state. We discuss the scored projects and make recommendations for application or priority specific adjustments that need to be made. And then the committee votes on the application fundings with the recommendations agreed to by the committee. So in June, we see a full commission vote, and we also see the applicant notifications of funding decisions. So again, the application funding and recommendations that have been provided by the committees are reviewed by the full commission. The commission determines if any additional grant or priority specific adjustments are required for those recommendations. The vote on the application funding with recommendations agreed to by the commission is then completed. And then typically within a few weeks post the commission vote, we are able to get notifications out to applicants to be advised of the outcome of their review process through an automated notification email. And so you will receive a decision of typically of an approved funding notice, approval with possible reductions or approval with reductions, or a not funded notice. So from July to December, is the modifications review and is the modifications review and the project awards themselves. So the grant planners for each funding source, they review the assigned applications for compliance with federal and state funding guidelines, as well as application requirements. And this is just a more in-depth version of what we do during the preliminary phase, because there's a lot of pieces and parts that you might need to do and you might need to complete after we are able to get the decision for your funding that you would not be completing prior, because it's a heavy lift in a lot of ways to do those changes without having the funding decision yet. So we wait for this in-depth process after the funding decisions have been made. So the modifications notices are sent to the applicants to communicate required adjustments. So those, like I said, those in-depth reviews and edits that are necessary before they can be opened. So applicants are responsible during this time to make the required adjustments and resubmit the applications through EBS along with those completed forms. So that it wouldn't be an instance where you would complete a whole new application or you would complete a whole new section. You would be making edits to that application that you submitted and that was funded. So planners then at the end of this process review the applications for final completion of the required changes and review forms, including for agencies who are newly funded, who have not been funded before. There's some additional considerations and items that need to be completed, but then that is completed during that time. So upon completion of all these modifications, the award letters containing the binding award documents, federal and state special conditions, and any additional documentation requirements are sent to the applicants. So the award document is signed initially by the Governor's Crime Commission's executive director, and then it requires signatures of the authorizing official and project director after that. The completed award packets are required to be returned to GCC within 30 days. So it's, again, you're gonna hear this a lot, but we're gonna continue to stress it that as a result of these pieces of the process, and as a result of these timelines that we really want to make sure we adhere to, it's very, very important that you keep your officials and your contact information up to date, and that you're communicating with your grant planners and with your grant administrators any turnover and any changes that need to be made. So once the completed award packets are signed, they then come back to GCC staff once more for final review and compliance for the next step of the process. So ideally, October 1st, projects open. So there's, of course, an asterisk by that. One, because of the fact that the juvenile justice grants open January 1st, but also as a result of that most of the periods of performance start October 1st, but as I mentioned at the beginning, there are a lot of circumstances that including this most recent year, the EBS transition, which a lot of folks are familiar with, that impacted our ability to stay closely to this calendar. So we typically will send out any sort of updates or communications that we can to notify you of any straying from the October 1st date. But so the grant administrator will work with the project director to open the project after the organization's transition from the grant planner to their assigned grant administrator. The grant administrator approval is required for contracts and travel related project spending prior to the expenditure of funds, even though the expenditure of funds can begin at the beginning of the period of performance. So can begin October 1st with that approval. And then once again, stressing that project funds cannot be expended prior to the start date for your period of performance. Any funds that are expended prior to the start date of your period of performance will not be reimbursed. So that is a general overview of the GCC grant award calendar. So we appreciate, I know that there was comments and questions in the chat. So hopefully we'll be able to, if they haven't already been answered, we will get those answered promptly, as Jason mentioned, in regards to our frequently asked questions and getting this resource updated and posted to the GCC website. But we appreciate your time.